the name of the holy and living God, amen. Please be seated. So as I think many of you know, I am no gardener. I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I have lived in apartments my entire life, which means I have to admit something. I didn't actually learn what a weed was until I was an adult. I remember the moment vividly. I was 19 years old. I was at the wedding of a close family friend in the Berkshires. It was one of those beautiful backyard weddings where everyone pitches in before the ceremony. And I asked the mother of the bride if there was anything I could do to help. She said, actually, we could use a few more flowers on the reception tables. Could you take this jar and these scissors and go over there and gather whatever you can find? She pointed toward this tall, grassy area just beyond the wedding tent. Now, until then, every bouquet of flowers I'd ever seen had come from a bodega or a flower shop. So I wandered over there, I clipped everything that looked kind of nice to me, and then I proudly carried my bouquet back. Before I made it to the tent, another family friend intercepted me. She looked at the jar, she gasped, and she said, "Those are weeds." She started pulling the stems out one by one until eventually I just handed over the whole bouquet and let her sort it out. I've since learned that weeds are complicated. And although that friend seemed to be most offended by the look of them, it's actually what they do while they're growing that cause the most harm. In many cases, the gardener's task is to pull weeds and prune the plants so that whatever is meant to grow has the greatest chance to thrive. But once you have an eye for weeds, it's hard to unsee them. This is where I now understand that friend's impulse. Even though the weeds were no longer harming the cut flowers, whatever weed, like daffodils or whatever weeds they were, she just couldn't stand the sight of them. It's like, get them out. In our gospel reading for today, the servants face a different situation. Jesus tells the story of a farmer who sows good wheat in his field. But in the middle of the night, an enemy comes and sows weeds among the wheat. As the plants begin to grow, the servants notice the problem. They go to the farmer and they ask, "Where did these weeds come from? Should we pull them out?" It seems like a perfectly reasonable question and possibly a good solution. The farmer tells them that an enemy has done this. But then he says something surprising. No, don't pull them. Let them grow together until the harvest. If you try to uproot the weeds now, you'll uproot the wheat too. When the disciples asked Jesus to explain the parable, he tells them that the sower is the Son of Man, the field is the world, the enemy is the devil, and the harvest is God's final redemption. It all seems pretty straightforward, and yet for centuries, Christians have misunderstood this passage. Christians have often read this passage, this parable, as though its primary purpose was to teach us how to distinguish the wheat from the weeds, who belongs to God and who doesn't. The church has never managed that task well. God. Some of us know what it feels like to be told by the church that we don't belong. Some of us have experienced the harm that comes when religion is more interested in sorting people than loving people. The harm can be crushing and cruel and violent. But that focus actually misses the point of the parable entirely, because it fails to see the role that Jesus is actually asking us to play. Notice what the servants ask. Should we pull them? And notice what the farmer says. No. That might be the most important word in the whole story. Not because the weeds aren't real, not because evil isn't real. Jesus is not naive. He knows there are forces in this world that oppose God's dream for creation. He knows that cruelty is real, that violence is real, that hatred is real. There are powers that seek to choke life, to diminish hope, to wound God's beloved. But the farmer refuses to hand the servants the job of sorting the field. As much as we love to be the ones who get to say, you're good and you're bad, you belong and you don't, you can stay and you need to get out, Jesus tells us no. While the servants are focused on eliminating the weeds, the farmer's first concern is protecting the wheat. Those are two completely different imaginations, and they orient our roles and our work in the world differently. We live in a culture that constantly invites us to identify villains, to purify our communities, to divide the world into the righteous and the wicked. The urge to other and to vilify the other is one of the most dangerous and destructive human impulses. Jesus invites us to ask different questions. How do we protect what gives life? How do we nurture mercy? How do we make room for compassion? How do we tend the fragile shoots of hope that are growing all around us? Maybe that's why the image of a weed is such a good one. Weeds compete for sunlight, they steal nutrients, they wrap themselves around healthy plants, they choke what is trying to grow. We know those weeds: fear, resentment, greed, racism, violence, shame. The lie that some people matter more than others, the lie that we are beyond God's love. These are the forces that choke life. They're real. And Christ comes to free us from them. The good news of the gospel is not that the weeds don't exist. The good news is that they don't get the final word. Notice what the farmer promises. There will come a day when everything that chokes life will be removed. Everything that oppresses God's beloved will lose its hold. Everything that diminishes God's creation will be undone. That's God's work, not ours. Ours is to reckon with the world that surrounds us in all of its brokenness and imperfection, and to keep tending the wheat. If there's one thing that Christian faith understands, it's that violence and cruelty and evil, and even death itself, cannot ultimately overcome the power of God's love. Throughout the Gospels, people expect God to defeat evil the way empires do, with force, with domination, with winners and losers. Even at the foot of the cross, as Jesus hangs, beaten and abused, the crowds taunt him. If you are the Son of God, save yourself, they say. But Jesus chooses another way. He bears hatred without becoming hatred. He endures violence without returning violence. He refuses to let evil dictate the terms of God's love. The cross is not God's surrender to evil. It is God's refusal to become evil in order to defeat it. And on Easter morning, God does not erase Good Friday. God transforms it. The very place that looked like death's greatest victory becomes the place where life breaks through the soil. which means that God's redemption is not simply a promise for some distant future. It is already taking root among us. Every act of mercy, every act of forgiveness, every table where strangers become neighbors, every time compassion triumphs over contempt, every time life is reclaimed from despair, every inch of freedom won. Those are signs that the harvest has already begun. And yet we know that there are so many days when it doesn't feel that way. There are days and seasons when the weeds seem to be growing faster than the wheat. We look around, we see families torn apart by immigration policies, innocent people shot dead in their cars by ICE agents. We witness wars that seem to have no end. We remember beloved members of this community, like Mark, who were taken from us much too soon, and whose absence is still so painful. We know what it is to watch something beautiful struggle beneath the weight of cruelty and injustice and illness and death. The gospel never asks us to deny that reality. In our reading from Romans, the Apostle Paul says that the whole creation is groaning, longing to be set free. And yet, even in the groaning, we have already received the first fruits of the Spirit. That is the strange hope of our faith. Not that suffering isn't real, not that evil has disappeared, but that resurrection has entered the world before evil has left it. Look at Jacob in the first reading we heard today. He's alone in the wilderness, sleeping on a stone, running for his life. Surely that was the last place he expected to meet God. And yet in the dark of night, the voice of God comes to him in a dream and whispers, "Know that I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go." When Jacob awakes, he says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." That may be our calling too, to become people that recognize that God is still in this place, in this wounded world, in this imperfect church, in this grieving community, in our own fragile hearts. As we get older, we all learn to see the weeds. But the real scandal of the gospel is not that the weeds are there. The scandal of the gospel is that God keeps growing wheat anyway. God keeps planting mercy in a world marked by violence. God keeps bringing forth compassion in a culture of contempt. God keeps calling forth life in places that seem overwhelmed by death. The question for us is, can we recognize that life that God is still growing? Can we see the mercy that is taking root? Can we tend the hope that refuses to die? Can we trust the gardener to tend the wheat, to protect life, to make room for love? Can we trust that even now, in a world where wheat and weeds still grow together, the gardener has not abandoned the field? And one day, every force that has ever choked God's beloved will finally lose its grip.